And so I was thinking about what Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, you must write it. So there's so many different layers of this. Like I wanted to bring this what I do in the clinical work, what I've done in my own life, and also as a sort of homage to my mom to say, look, there's so much more within this. And that's what I mean. OCD certainly can be a very challenging, torturous, disabling condition. But at the same time, I don't want people to lose the gold. There's a lot of dirt, but it's pay dirt. There's a lot of gold in OCD.
It's a great pleasure to have clinical psychologist Michael Alcee on the show. In this episode, we have a refreshing humanistic discussion about obsessive compulsive disorder. Michael is critical of the standard medical model of OCD and points out the upsides of OCD. He argues that people with OCD have a unique temperament, which includes heightened existential sensitivity and a richer imagination. While people with OCD certainly have their struggles and tend to be obsessed about causing harm or receiving harm, Michael also points us to all the ways that OCD have historically been channeled into some of the greatest works of art and literature, and how everyone with OCD can have a healthier relationship with their OCD. So without further ado, I bring you Michael Alcee. Michael Alcee, how are you?
So good to see you. So good to meet in person finally.
Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, two Jews with OCD sitting with a candle between us.
It's the perfect environment. It's the perfect ambiance for two humanists to really have a conversation.
Yeah, let's change that identity. Yeah, two humanists.
Humanists.
Yeah. Well, what does it mean to be humanist?
Yeah, I think just funny thing, the humanist thing is so interesting because creativity is the centrality, I think, of being human. And being able to be with the contradiction and complexity and nuance, the messiness of it. Yeah. But also the transcendence of it, right? Yes. They kind of go together, right? Which I think is the brilliant part. Like Leonard Cohen said, if you don't become the ocean, you'll be seasick every day.
I love almost every Leonard Cohen quote, including that one. So you are a clinical psychologist, and you specialize in existential humanistic approaches. Is that right?
It's integrative. So for me, existential and humanistic and psychodynamic and...
Wow, you sneak in a little psychodynamic.
All of it.
It's still in.
It's still in.
Wow.
Because it's all relational.
Yes.
And anything that's human requires relationship. Right. So, that's the challenge is being a fully embodied self, an actualized self in relationship to others.
Do you bring in Jungian?
Oh, completely.
Depth analysis?
Yeah. Because
Can
Jung,
I be your patient?
Oh, completely. Because Jung was so much more open to the beauty of creativity and nuance, which I think the humanists took back.
Yeah.
And I think they reclaimed it, which was really important.
The humanistic psychologist, you mean?
The humanistic psychologist, the existential psychologist, know.
You know what's interesting? I actually make a distinction between like the humanistic psychologist and the humanism movement. Yeah. Because I feel like they're different. Like humanists tend to be like the Steven Pinker, hyper-rational, it's all about logic. Yeah. Whereas I actually think the humanistic psychologists were more about being a whole human. And they're just separate things. Neither is better than the other, but I just feel like the humanism movement's different than the humanistic psychology movement. Do you agree?
I agree. I think actually, but if you look at the thread of humanism throughout history, like you see like the Shakespearean kind of thing, right? The Shakespeare, I think, is the uber humanist, and the Renaissance Da Vinci and all of this stuff. I think that brings it in, and I think you're right. I think one of the things that's really exciting about where psychology is right now as a field is that we're embracing more of the feeling poetic side as well as the logical linear side. Yeah. And to be a humanist is to embrace so I like to think of us as sophisticated emotion regulation machines and idea generators.
Sophisticated.
Completely.
That was a sophisticated sentence.
Right? And even, the funny thing is we pretend not to be sophisticated, or we pretend to be sophisticated.
No, I pretend to be sophisticated.
All the time. All the time. But we have both. And it reminds me of like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, remember, like with the square and the circle?
Oh, yeah.
So the square is the logic and the circle is the emotion. It's the poetic and the linear. And for my money, like the humanistic is about embracing the contradictions and complexities of that.
Well, on that backdrop, let's talk about OCD. Yeah. The topic of your book is called The Upside of OCD. Flip the Script to reclaim your life. Now, a lot of people who've been diagnosed with OCD, I do think, feel like they are out of control in their lives. That was a really deliberate phrasing in your title, obviously. And it's a very unique book you wrote. And I just want to say up front, I thought it was a really great book. Obviously, I invited you to be on my podcast. And it's a book that I think virtually everyone who has been diagnosed with OCD or that's part of their identity could really benefit from to expand their identity. I would phrase it that way.
Yeah.
You know, not replace, you know, but give a more expansive view of who they are and what they're capable of. So really congratulations on this amazing book. I wanted to ask you, what is the clinical diagnostic criteria for OCD? Let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
And then I want to ask you, why are you not so happy with how it's currently framed?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, it's obsessions and compulsions. So the obsessions are these tendency to have intrusive thoughts, right? They're often centered about, did I potentially harm somebody by mistake? Am I clean enough? Did I think something blasphemous or immoral? Did I count enough? Did I order things enough? All these things that kind of you ruminate on in a way that you sort of can't stop even though you'd like to. And the compulsion part of it is the side, well, I want to do something to feel more in control and to soothe the anxiety around this nagging obsession. So I'm going to wash my hands. I'm going to cancel the thoughts with a mantra or a prayer. I'm going to try to do something that purges me of this nagging feeling. And so obsessions and compulsions go hand in hand.
Really well put. You know, as a humanistic, we're both humanistic psychologists, first of all. So
yes.
Go us. Woo, I felt that.
Right, you feel that.
Woo! We're flying,
it was like Adam and God, right between there.
We're flying close to the flame there. But we're both humanistic psychologists, and a big part of the humanistic psychology movement was not wanting to neglect the experiential aspect of what it means to be human, because they were really counter sort of the Freudian and as well as the reductionism of Skinner, B.F. Skinner. Yeah. So let's really discuss, you know, what it's like to have OCD and really get into that.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point that, you know, everywhere in psychology, in the history of psychotherapy, we find something and then we feel like we're missing something. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's where it's really important to be, as Howard Gardner says, a synthesizing mind, right? Somebody who kind of draws from things. So I was reading Matthew Syed is a British writer who's written a great book called Rebel Ideas. And he says there's something about incremental innovation and then there's recombinant innovation, which is when you pull from different areas. So the thing that I'm not so pleased with where OCD is currently is that it's looked at like in this kind of linear, literal way, right? You have these obsessions, you have these compulsions, right? That's it.
Yeah.
But I actually see it from a completely different framework, which is sort of similar to how Susan Cain looks at introverts. That people with OCD have a unique temperament and sensibility of sensitivity, an empathic sensitivity. There's research out of Germany that shows that people with OCD are more empathically tuned in than not only healthy controls, but people with other garden variety anxieties.
Is there a correlation between OCD diagnosis and scoring high on the highly sensitive person scale?
I would,
like the Aronson.
I would bet money on that completely. And I think they're sort of overlapping.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And so the other part of the temperament, like we were joking about before we got on here, is that there's an existential sensitivity. So if you're empathic and you notice how people feel and what their experience is, if you're intuitively tuned into them, you also notice when they get hurt. You also notice when there's ruptures. This is what makes us good therapists. That's why actually there's a lot of therapists, I think, who do have OCD tendencies, because it actually makes us really good at noticing. We have a sixth sense of empathy and intuition. The second piece, the people with OCD that is lost in the medical model version, is that people with OCD have a very imaginative mind, a very fertile imagination. Right? They go into what-if spirals, thought spirals, and rabbit holes. But if you actually look at the mind, it's not too different from the obsessional aspect of creativity. And it's no surprise that Charles Darwin struggled with OCD. Because if you think of the brilliance with which he looked at different angles of things and went down all sorts of different places, there's a connection.
I didn't know Charles Darwin had OCD.
He worried that his children would die. He was concerned about reassurance. There's a story of him in the middle of the night going to his friend's house to make sure he didn't offend him. He struggled with a lot of these things that we would consider classic OCD symptoms.
That's so fascinating. What's actually neurologically going on in people who have OCD? What's the
going
latest neuroscience?
I wish I was as up to date. I remember when I was in college, I did an extra credit paper, and I was looking at all the data neurologically. They look at the caudate nucleus and they look at areas and try to see what kind of activity is going on in there. And I think still the jury is out on exactly. But I do think one of the things that's really fascinating about OCD is that it's very much nature and nurture. There's certainly a biological component to the fact of having a tendency to spiral, to ruminate, but also to be empathically tuned in. And I think that's where I think that what gets missing in current ideas about OCD is not looking at, I call people with OCD, they have extraordinarily generous heart. You know how in the Grinch had a heart 10 sizes too small?
Yes.
People with OCD have a heart 10 sizes too big.
Wow.
But then they almost don't keep track of themselves.
Wow.
They're much, like Freud said at one point, the person with OCD is probably the most scrupulous member of society, though they treat themselves as if they are a mass murderer.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So the lack of self-compassion and self-advocacy for a person with OCD is extraordinarily interesting. And so my take on it is, wait, how do we harness the beauty of that big heart, but also turn it towards the self? There's a great poem by Derek Walcott, Love After Love, one of Obama's favorite poems. He says, the time will come with elation when you will greet yourself in your own mirror.
Wow.
Sit, feast on your own life.
Wow.
Right? Give back the love who you've given to another. And I think people with OCD need to give back that love. And so my mission, if it should be so, is to change the dialogue and conversation about what OCD is, what it could be, how we can understand it, how we could treat it. And I was thinking, you remember the old Solomon Asch experiment?
Yeah.
So Solomon Asch, for those who don't remember, he was at Swarthmore College and he did this famous social psychology experiment where he's like trying to figure out, it was supposedly a vision test, which is the correct line that corresponds to this one. Yeah. And of course, he had all these Confederates.
I'd be like, oh, hell no.
Yeah, I'd be like, what?
No,
but of course, in maybe I think 2/3 to 75% of the people conformed to the dominant view, which they knew was wrong.
And those people ended up being less creative as adults.
Completely. But he did another condition, as you recall, where he had one dissenter.
Oh.
And that one dissenter took the conformity down 80%. Wow. I'm that guy.
Yes, yes.
So that's what I want to do for OCD, is to dissent, to say, wait, there's more. I know the consensus right now is that this is what OCD is or could be, but there's more. And I think that's actually really hopeful.
Yes. And your book, it's very clear that you're trying to restore the humanity to OCD. And I'm not going to say but because your book is all about both and. Your whole book is about both and. I will say that for those who are in the grips of OCD, all this is very cold comfort.
Yes.
So for me, it takes the form of one of the biggest forms it takes is checking. Yeah. So if I'm in the airport, I have to keep, and whenever I'm in a nervous state, like about to board an airplane, or I have to keep making sure. Oh, did I leave anything at the store?
Check the stove. Yeah. Even though,
and I get to the point where I actually take a picture of my apartment before I leave, so that when I worry later,
I took a picture of the parking spot to make sure that it was legal, even though it's probably.
So this is normal OCD,
totally,
or normal, normal, not normal behavior.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. So when my point is experientially, when I'm in the grips of that, you could come up to me and be like, "Hey, Scott, but you have great existential sensitivity." I'd be like, "Go fuck off." I'm trying to get over this moment I'm having right now.
Totally.
So, what is your advice? When you have clients who come sit down and are really suffering so much, how can they hold both of these things? Because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying go fuck off in general, right? Because I think your message is amazing. I want to be very clear.
No, that was a New Jersey hello. I get that. It's all good.
But you know what I'm saying? Not in general. Your message is wonderful and it needs to be said.
No, but you bring up a really good point, which I think is really important. And the title is a little deceiving, which is it's actually as much about the downsides as it is about the upside.
Yeah.
So this book isn't meant to glorify or glamorize these other wonderful facets behind OCD. I actually think these facets exist before OCD hits the scene. I think OCD comes about by the lack of mentorship with how to work with this.
Oh, wow.
Right. So if you were like, I'm going to steal from Elizabeth Gilbert, the writer, she talks about being a creative person is like being a border collie. And if a border collie doesn't have enough good activity, they'll tear the place apart. Now, a person with OCD is a border collie in terms of how active their heart is and how active their mind is. If they don't understand how to train that, they're going to tear themselves apart, right? But what you said too about this is cold comfort when I'm in the middle of a spiral. Yeah. So I'll share with you a funny example of when I got into a spiral. So during COVID, about 6 to 8 weeks in, I started to get haunted by an obsession. Yeah. So maybe I had a cavity, and maybe I was going to need a filling or a crown or a root canal. And then all of a sudden, I started to obsess. Yeah. What if I go to the dentist and I get COVID and I give it to my family and they all die? Or what if I stay home and don't get this taken care of? And then I'm in slow agony, right? And then what if, because I have this cavity and it's not treated, I get something? And then ironically, I don't even die from COVID, I die from something else, right? So having OCD is like, that's the spiral, right? And it's a lot like a Law and Order episode.
Yeah, you know how like degree, you go to the nth degree.
You know, and you go to the nth degree, and then like a Law and Order episode, you know how like you always think that first guy in the first 15 minutes, that's the guy. So I thought,
it's never that guy.
It's never that guy. So I thought it was a toothache.
It's usually the girl.
It's complete, and it's also like the person who doesn't look like the jerk.
Yeah.
So as I'm going down with this, I say to myself, Mike, you're spiraling. Yeah. And you know you're spiraling, but I was like, wait a minute. So you know how they do exposure exercises? The typical thing would be, all right, just embrace the uncertainty that the shitty thing is happening, and you're not going to give it too much credence, right? Yeah. But I said, wait a minute, let me like check in with my feelings. Mike, what else are you feeling? Yeah. Maybe that you're not focusing on. Because OCD is really interesting. It tries to distract us while it's also trying to focus us. Yeah. So then I said, wait, Mike, it's 2 months into COVID.
Great point.
This is creeping me out. This is scaring me. Yeah. This is terrifying me. And watching my son pretend to be at the places that he would be out in the world down in the basement was making me sad. So I was feeling sad. I was feeling scared. I was feeling like I should be tough, but I'm not feeling tough. And as soon as I let that emotion come out, the tooth started bothering me. The obsession started to vanish.
Really?
Yeah. Because again, I found the real perp. The real perp was understanding, and again, it's an existential concern. Notice, I was worried about death. I was worried about loss. I was worried about all these things. And of course, what is it? The sideshow is it's a toothache. But it was a toothache signaling something, but also concealing. It's everything that Freud said about a compromise formation. It both expresses and conceals. It's very, very sophisticated. And the reason I say that is because most ERP, exposure response prevention, right, which is the main gold standard for treating OCD, which is to basically not seek reassurance, to allow whatever, allow the thought that you have a toothache and you might not get it fixed or, whatever, and try not to look for reassurance and all that stuff. But instead, I also think there's a way of actually being exposure to the feelings.
Something a little more human.
And the context. What was the so people who in the ERP world, you know what they say? The content doesn't matter. Because it's just going to morph to anything else. But I think actually, I'll grant you, maybe the content doesn't matter. The context does. And that's where I think it actually brings it back to humanism. So there's an interesting meme in the OCD recovery world, which some people find very comforting. I find it actually surprisingly strange, but I'll explain why. They say OCD is like sound and fury signifying nothing. You know, that quote from Macbeth?
Yeah.
Which is to say, all this stuff is not really real. Don't let it get to you. It's just bullshit.
Yeah.
Now, that's comfort in some ways, right?
Yeah.
But what if there's some healthy meaning in this? So the meaning that was trying to be a messenger to me was trying to say, Mike, you're scared and you have a hard time being with that. Right? Wow. COVID you're feeling this existential concern and you're sensitive to that. So you're going to feel it. Right?
How does that apply to checking? What's the upside of being in an airport store and not wanting to leave the store and board the airplane because you think, did I leave something in the store? Yeah.
Well, think about this. It's also, again, free therapy for Scott right here, right? It's also because if you think about it, it's a place where I don't feel in control. The root is I don't feel in control. And you know what? The other thing is people with OCD actually, and just people in general, we're aware of change. Change is happening all the time. And when you're sensitive to how easy change can happen. So I think actually people with OCD are using rituals to hold on to some stability when they recognize that everything is changing.
But nailed it.
And that's why when you say, you're right, this is weird, I don't know. There's a little bit of shifting here. I don't like that. What can I hold on to?
That's right.
Right? Again, that's the existential thing. What can I hold on to? Right? It's like facing death. I can't hold on. Life is here, but I know that it's going to be taken away.
Totally.
Yeah.
So what do I do?
So there you go. Then you remind yourself, and then you come to your feelings. Because remember, OCD likes to take us into our worried mind. And we get disembodied. Oh, wait, am I feeling like I'm afraid I'm going to forget something? And, I'm in the middle of this transit and I feel like, great, what am I feeling? Am I feeling stressed from how much I've had to wait for this plane to get up? All this stuff.
So it's so good, because when I'm in a relaxed state, I would care less about what I left at an airport store.
Completely, and that's what I'm saying.
In a particular state, because I've had to spend many years overcoming my fear of flying. And I've overcome it, but there's still residual sort of nerves right before I board.
Well, that's the context.
Yeah.
See, that's where I think meaning is important.
I get it. That's why the
context is super.
You'll grant them that content doesn't matter, but you're not going to grant them that context doesn't.
The funny thing is, content doesn't matter, right? It really wasn't my toothache that was the issue. But it really was pointing to something that was an issue.
Sometimes the cigar is not
a cigar.
Yeah, exactly. We're redoing that quote. We're redoing that one.
It's funny too, Scott. It's interesting because I think one of the reasons why there is such an interest and movement towards the behavioral is because I think there was sort of, in the early days of OCD treatment, it could be analytic and very cerebral. And sometimes it wasn't focusing enough on that really concrete stuff and how this was affecting. And I also think there was a sort of trauma response in the field to how that hurt people and made them feel like they weren't getting what they want. But here's to quote Drew Weston, that was a different vintage of psychoanalysis. That's like 1912. 2024 is a much more relational, interpersonal, also intrapsychic, but in a really kind of nuanced way. And I really would love CBT people to see that actually talking about affect, talking about meaning is exposure too. I really think it's important for us to be multilingual as therapists.
What do you think of the ACT approach?
I think the ACT approach is lovely. I think, again, like I said with that Leonard Cohen quote, if you can't become the ocean, you'll be seasick, right? It's wonderful to embrace stuff. So the only thing that I think is missing, I think ACT is like Buddhism, right? It's great for you to be Zen about accepting things and not being too attached. But I think what we need with that is also the meaning says, but what am I making of this? Because remember, we're meaning creatures. We need to make stories. We need to have coherence. And that's the other thing is I don't think of OCD as just this alien thing that is like a sickness that descends upon you. I also think of it as trying to tell you stuff about what you're experiencing yourself in your world, which is about making meaning, right? I made meaning when I was like, wait, this isn't about the toothache. This is about these deep feelings, these deep thoughts that I'm having. So I really don't see it contradictory to have it be both meaningless and meaningful.
Fair enough. You talked a little bit about the traditional approach, ERP. And you have a quote I have here responding to that later in your book, but I highlighted it and I love it. And I just want to double click on this quote of yours.
All right.
Quote, does the treatment out there really appreciate, understand, and explain the overly generous and empathic heart of those with OCD? Does it see the creative possibility and power within the expansive mind and creative prowess of the OCD sufferer? Does it pay heed to the inner story and potential trauma that can originate or exacerbate OCD? That is a beautiful poetic quote. Like you're a poet yourself. That was really poetic.
I didn't even realize I wrote that. So that's cool.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that encapsulates a lot of the upsides of OCD right there. Well, a lot of writers must have had OCD.
John Green is a really phenomenal example. He wrote a novel called Turtles All the Way Down, which is a protagonist is a young girl with OCD. But any of his other books, the thing that I always think is interesting about John Green is he talks about, I'm good now because my OCD is treated with medication or with, CBT. And I'm like, John, buddy, wait. The nuance and sophistication and sensitivity of your work is because of all this stuff.
Did you tell him that?
I haven't. John, if you're watching, John, I think your writing is brilliant. Yeah. And also the other thing about Green's writing is...
You just broke the third wall.
I broke the... Oh, my God. Sorry. So the thing is, if you look at John Green's books, so much about his existential issues, right? Yeah. Fault in Our Stars is about two characters who have cancer, who are dealing with looking death in the eye. Right. So if you look at, there's so many creative people and scientific people, like I said, Charles Darwin, Nikola Tesla had this funny counting obsessions. He needed to do things in threes. And if he didn't go around the block 3 times, he'd have to continue it. He needed to live in an apartment that was a multiple of 3. Right. We have, the musician and producer Jack Antonoff talks openly about his OCD, but also he doesn't see it as just a detrimental thing. Camila Cabello talks about, she was on Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard, and she said, listen, I don't even call it OCD with my therapist. We call it my obsessionality. Right. And she had all sorts of classic OCD. Like, she thought when she was young that because she didn't have her period for the year that she was the Virgin Mary. And she had all of the things that you'd expect in classic OCD. But she also, I think, sees this hidden upside that we're talking about. And that's what I think is really extraordinary. And that imaginative mind, that nuanced, intuitive, emotional sixth sense, just like what Susan Cain did for introverts and saying, wait, we just don't know how to approach people with this and to support them best. And there's so much strengths, and we can also work on the difficulties, right, at the same time.
I mean, it's fascinating. This is news to me that OCD is correlated with divergent thinking ability. And I actually haven't seen studies on that. I've seen studies linking ADD with creative thinking, but OCD, I feel like
there's some studies about OCD. There's some studies about OCD and creativity.
Please send them to me. Yeah. Because I think that's a missing part of the creativity literature. And
I'm going to do a plug for you a moment. When I was reading about your background, I was talking to you before about the dual theory of intelligence that you worked on.
The only one who knows about it.
I'm the only, it's what's so cool about it is because the dual theory, the part that you're focusing on is exactly the part that I think is missing in OCD treatment, which is the metaphorical, the intuitive.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
So right now treatment is literal, which is one eye. We need the metaphorical to get real depth perception.
Well, I really appreciate you appreciating that. My dual was called the dual process theory of human intelligence. A big part of my dissertation was arguing that the field has really ignored the cognitive processes that contribute to artistic creativity.
Yeah.
So that was a big impetus of my dissertation because it's focused so much on IQ.
Yeah.
And a conscious logical reasoning that it correlates with creative achievement.
Yeah.
But researchers were starting to act as though, to the extent to which it deviates from its correlation with creative achievement is the extent to which it's lower in intelligence. And I was like, oh, hell
no. Yeah.
Hell no.
I got to get in on this.
You all are missing at least 50% of human cognition or the benefits of
it's huge.
Yeah. Thank you so much for...
It's huge. And I think Antonio Damasio has done a brilliant job of really showcasing that.
Yes.
I think, in terms of looking at the contributions of this stuff, it's super important. Actually, you know what I think is a cultural piece that's really interesting?
Yeah.
So I think actually part of our movement towards this is the way things have shifted in our landscape, right? And if you think about technology, it's allowed a lot more introverts to get into the mix. You've gotten a lot more imaginative stuff going on. There's more. If you think about it, in the old computer days or the old post-industrial revolution, left brain linear thinking was prioritized. And I think now you're seeing, just like Daniel Pink says, right, the right brain stuff is really important now because we've also moved computers to do all that left brain stuff better than us. So I think actually one of the reasons why this is super important is because I think the field is still staying with the cultural thing of the left brain.
Because they're all nerds. I mean, the people who are in the doing the research themselves aren't artists.
Yeah, and I think you need both. And so you know how they talk about in OCD treatment embracing uncertainty?
Yeah.
Right? Which is it's a wonderful concept.
Yeah.
So John Keats, the poet, romantic poet, had this lovely concept called negative capability.
Oh.
Negative capability is basically allowing yourself not to let reason just take you where you go, but to allow the openness to ambiguity and mystery, right?
Love that. That's so Susan Cain.
That's so Susan Cain, right? Wouldn't she love that? I know.
She would. In her book, Bittersweet.
Yeah. Totally.
No, I mean, it's so me too. I love it. I absolutely love it. You say, my paradoxical take on OCD is captured beautifully by Carl Jung. Quote, it seems that all true things must change, and only that which changes remains true.
Yeah. Yeah, that blew my mind.
You said this is the embodiment and essence of OCD's upside. Can you
That's
elaborate?
completely it. Yeah.
And I stole about that one, audience.
Yeah, and I stole that from Brad Stolberg, who wrote a beautiful book called Master of Change.
Good friend of mine, yeah.
Yeah, he's wonderful. And the reason I said is because actually what you even write about, it's a kind of connection here, is when, change is the central thing. So I don't know if I stole this from somewhere. So just if I stole this from you, I apologize. But my definition of creativity, or my stolen one, is creativity is the art of changing while staying the same. Wow. That's what psychological creativity is, right?
Wow.
Right. And Tony Robbins once said in a talk that I heard, humans love two things. They love stability and they love change.
Yes.
So, but to be a creative person, not just in the arts or in the sciences, but psychologically. Yes. And that's what we do as therapists. We allow people to experiment with changing while still saying, well, you're still the same. Right? Yeah. And so the paradox of being able to work with that in fluid and interesting ways is the thing. And for people with OCD, they're super aware of change. And that's why they need to keep things controlled, because they're aware of the essence of how you can never step in the same river twice. Right? But the beautiful thing, and that's what I meant about the Leonard Cohen quote, but if you can be like that ocean.
Yeah.
Right?
That's you're golden. You're starting to sound like Bruce Lee for a second there.
Right? Yeah, be the water.
Yeah. But there's a lot of concomitant, OCD is an interesting one out of all of them.
Yeah.
If you view it as a constellation of stars. Yeah. OCD seems to pair nicely. Yeah. It's like the one that pairs nicely with everything else. Yeah. All the other disorders. Yeah. You tend to see autism has a lot of comorbidity. Yep. You see schizophrenia has the comorbidity. It's like OCD tags on to everything. Right. I don't know what to make of that, but it's something I noticed in the psychiatric literature. It's like OCD is really a really high comorbid one with lots of other things, because maybe part of it, and I'd love to hear what your thought is, the thread there is, high anxiety runs through everything. Yeah. That's high neuroticism.
And the need for control, right? Which is in neuroticism.
Everything. The personality trait neuroticism has been found to be the thread personality trait that runs through every single mental disorder. Yeah. The person who has like a 0 neuroticism score tends to be emotionally, they're boring.
I was going to say,
boring. Do you want to be friends with that person?
I don't know whether they're saying congratulations or I'm sorry.
0 or 100% emotional stability. They're always practical. They make the right choices. Yeah. They never worry. They have no conscience. They have no guilt. Anyway. Yeah. But it just is interesting that, you can, OCD shows up in lots of different packages, a lot of different in the whole neurodiversity world. Yeah. You can have different profiles. If you met one person with OCD, you've met one person with OCD, right? Yeah. Just like if you met one person with autism, you met one person with autism, because, you can have, all sorts of ways that it combines and mixes together. And anyway. Yeah.
And I think another thing that people forget about OCD is that it actually kind of showcases the quintessential dilemma of being human.
Oh, great. Great poetic.
So if you think about it, like the real quote for OCD is not life is, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. It's to be or not to be. The question that a person with OCD is always asking is, what's it like to be and to realize that we're not going to be? So if I like to think of people with OCD as existentialists from the start who never read Kierkegaard or Sartre and didn't have the lexicon and the support with understanding how to hold and carry that fire of those feelings, right? And I think that's why actually when we we forget this, but when Freud was studying, he studied like the rat man was his quintessential OCD cases. That's where he develops this conflict between this moral side of us, the superego, and the id, which is the aggressive side. Because people with OCD are really cagey around their wild side.
Oh, what do you mean? Tell me more.
Well, you know,
they're afraid of it getting out of control.
Yeah. And so what do they obsess about? I'm really out of control. Right? Right? I'm going to kill somebody. I'm going to do something obscene. I'm going to do something horrific. I am something horrific.
That's so interesting.
Right? And Freud was onto that very early. And the point of that, I think that's really crucial here, is that it's not easy being human to reconcile these full-throated feelings, sometimes of which the other reason that people with OCD are so concerned is because they're worried about being harmful.
They're so worried about harm.
Because feelings, it's hard to take up space. It takes a little, I have a mentor who said to me, it takes a little aggression to have a self.
Yeah. Wow, you're blowing my mind.
Right?
I need to process that last one because I was already processing what you said, the sentence before, and then you're throwing one thing to process after another. You know, it is so profound what you're talking about. One of my favorite psychotherapists, Carl Rogers, a humanistic, part of the original humanistic psychologist group, he wrote in his book on becoming a person, he said, most of my patients, if not all my patients, are constantly terrified that they're going to release the beast. He has a whole section of his book on releasing the beast.
Yeah.
I always think about that because there's something very human about that fear. So yes, people with OCD might be that fear on steroids, but I think and he says in virtually all the cases, no one's released the beast when they have started the integration process.
Completely.
If anything, they become more socialized. They become more in control of themselves. And I'm going to end Carl Rogers and also say, you know, the mentality of the kind of person that they're fearing, you know, is the opposite actually of a psychopath.
Completely.
Because if you've ever hung out with a psychopath,
many times,
you know, and they're fun to party with. Yeah. But they never ask themselves. They're never concerned.
They're never asking themselves. They're not wrestling with the questions ever.
Nailed it.
Ever.
When you hang out with psychopaths, you never hear a psychopath say, oh my gosh, what if I release the beast? They're like, how can I, give me the context so I can release the beast.
Yeah, and that's,
do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's right. And there's two other things I was thinking about that, right? So you said something about the psychopath versus the person with OCD, right? Yeah. So the other thing is you're right about this wild side, right? So people with OCD fear this wild side.
They fear it.
Fear it. But I like to think of where the wild things are. Remember that story about little Max?
Yeah.
Like he actually is just getting to use his power. He's excited about, ooh, I'm powerful. I'm a wolf. And I'm chasing after the dog with a fork.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't really want to eat up the dog in terms of literally do it. He wants to eat up the world. But he doesn't know how to carry that along with being moral. Right? But that's why he needs to befriend the wild things, to say, no, that's good. You can integrate the wild things, but then his mom leads the bowl of soup to say, I still love you, even though you have this propensity to use power. Right? That's healthy aggression. And it's important, and again, you're right, the worry is that it will be, oh my gosh, I'm going to be the psychopath, right, if I have that. Yeah. No, it's hard to carry that. I call it like carrying a fire. It's hard to carry that fire.
The whole release the beast thing is interesting because another one of my favorite humanistic psychologists, Raoul May.
Me too.
I know we can talk the same language here. He has in one of his books, I forget which book, he talks about how he had this patient who was so terrified every time he walked past a window, he was scared he was going to jump out the window. He had these intrusive thoughts. Yeah. And he was walking with the patient one day, and they passed a open window, and Raoul May goes, "Jump, just jump." Like, what's stopping you?
Yeah.
And in that moment, he said that the guy's fear dissipated.
Completely. You need freedom.
Isn't that fascinating?
It's fascinating, and that's an exposure exercise right there, right? It's funny. Nobody would say Raoul May as an behaviorist, right? Yeah. And another Rogers that I love to think of is Mr. Rogers, because one of the things that's brilliant about Rogers is he was an artist. He was a subversive rebel. He took on consumer culture and said, "Okay, media, I'm going to use you for humanistic purposes." Yeah. And the thing with Rogers is that you think about it. Think of things he talked about. He talked about divorce. He talked about assassinations.
Oh, yeah.
He talked about race relations.
Oh, yeah.
He talked about
his daughter made him be more interested in feminism towards the end of it.
I mean, he talked about the most difficult things.
Yeah.
But because he approached it in that way.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I think there's a way of being with the wild stuff while also being very thoughtful.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. And that's what I want to bring back to the looking at the OCD treatment is that you can do both of these things.
Yeah, totally.
You know?
I like that you're also breaking stereotypes because, just to circle back to the psychopath thing, there is a stereotype, I think, that psychopaths are OCD, right? Like when depicted in, there's that famous movie, I forget what it is, but
American Psycho or
American
something?
Psycho, I think they always have to have everything in order,
there's also a difference between the personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and OCD. So the person with obsessive compulsive personality disorder has a very different sensibility. I do not think they have the deep empathy that the person with OCD has.
I didn't even know there was a difference between the two.
Yes.
You're saying there's a clinical version and a non-clinical version?
So there's the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that's the person who's very type A, who thinks, you know what, if you don't do this my way and line it up or do this, you're wrong.
Right.
And there's a self-righteousness about it. It's not uncommon for people with OCD to find people with OCD personality disorders because they complement each other well.
Yeah.
Right? Because those people with OCD personality disorder are very sure of themselves, almost too sure of themselves. And you're right that psychopath has some dimensions of that because there's a little bit of a narcissism.
They want to control everything, like this obsessive need to control.
Yeah, but again, in an egocentric way.
Yes, correct.
Right? Not something that I feel bad. Like, I'm not wrestling with that. So the difference is the wrestling. Yeah. So that's actually the saving grace of the person with OCD, that they wrestle.
You just blew my mind because I didn't know that there's in the clinical literature, there's a real important difference between OCD and obsessive compulsive disorder. Yeah. OCD obviously stands for
personality disorder. Yeah.
OCPD. OCPD.
Yeah.
I see.
No, so the reason is because nobody thinks about the personality style of the person with OCD.
Yeah.
It was actually really interesting that it would be confusing because we just think about the clinical symptoms of OCD without looking at what's the character, what's the...
But the upsides that you're referring to, are you saying that's more along the lines of the personality one?
No, this is only for the disorder.
For the disorder.
So there's actually it's funny, in the series that my book is published in, another author wrote about the personality disorder, which I haven't read, but I'm sure
the personality disorder is where you see maybe more the narcissism.
Yes,
I see what you're saying. I got it reversed.
And that's why the correlation. It's not surprising to have a psychopath who has OCPD tendencies.
I totally get it now.
Right, there could be overlap. Right,
I totally get it now. I thought you were doing the reverse. Yeah. So no, that makes that makes sense. Because I mean, you see that. Almost by definition, extreme narcissism is OCD to a certain extent because
everything can become
obsessive need to control and have power over others.
But you know what, Scott? You actually brought up a really good point. Two good points. One, that I think that we don't think about the personality of somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder because we think, oh wait, it's just these things, as if it's just symptoms glommed onto a person. But what if there's more about the personality and the style? Just like when you look at like a psychoanalysis, like what is the character organization, right? Is it a borderline organization? Is it a schizoid organization? So I think there's actually more to mine there.
Gotcha.
Right? About the psychopath thing.
Yeah.
So the difference with someone with OCD, one of my exercises for people with OCD is basically is how to be an asshole.
Oh, yeah.
But not really be an asshole.
Yeah.
Because people with OCD are worried about being an asshole.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But if you're really worried about being an asshole, you're not really an asshole. And you're certainly not a certifiable asshole. Yeah. And the fact that you grapple with that.
So good.
Right. So that's the difference. That's OCD. That's ego dystonic, right? I don't really want to be this. And the funny thing is, you know how I said that people with OCD have a hard time being assertive and selfish? You know when they can be?
When?
Well, you have to wash your hands now. Because my OCD tells me. You see? And you have to do this because I'm stressing. It's not me that's doing it. It's my OCD. So I'm not blaming myself.
Nailed it.
So I think actually OCD is a way of regulating boundaries because the person with OCD has a hard time just holding their boundaries and they get blurred with others. And so then they need the OCD to come in to help them. Right. So Robert Frost, I love poetry, said, first you be a person then I'll be a person, and then we'll be as interpersonal as we please.
Wonderful.
The person with OCD is so tuned into others, they almost they lose sense of themselves. And then the OCD in a way comes in to say, okay, that's how it's a messenger.
Wow, you've described my mom to a T.
I don't know whether to say I'm sorry or congratulations on that one either. But
you must wash your hands.
But that's what it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But now your mother
is
a little Michigan too, right?
She did. And my mom had contamination OCD. Also, when I was a child, like my mom, I worried that something was going to happen like terrible to my mom. Like third grade, it hit me like out of nowhere. And this worry that something, if I didn't do my prayers correctly in religious school, that something would happen. My mom had the same fear, so there's clearly a genetic link. But what I never understood, because there was no language for it at the time within OCD research or anything, there was a sensitivity. My mom was extraordinarily sensitive.
For sure.
She was a therapist as well. She was a literature buff because she was tuned into that stuff. But there was nothing out there. So when people ask me, like, I forgot to tell you this. I didn't think I was going to write this book. I didn't think I was going to need to write this book. So I did my dissertation on something like this, like 15, 20 years ago. And my mentor was a big OCD researcher named Dean McKay. And he was cool enough to take a gamble on me looking at cognitive behavioral and psychoanalysis and attachment theory and bringing it all together. And I thought, cool, this was a cool project. Someone's going to put this together. I don't have to worry about it. 20 years later, I'm like, why haven't? And so I was thinking about what Toni Morrison said. If there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, you must write it. So there's so many different layers of this. I wanted to bring this what I do in the clinical work, what I've done in my own life, and also as a sort of homage to my mom to say, look, there's so much more within this. And that's what I mean. OCD certainly can be a very challenging, torturous, disabling condition. But at the same time, I don't want people to lose the gold. There's a lot of dirt, but it's pay dirt. There's a lot of gold in OCD.
I mean, it's a really expansive view of it that's been neglected in the psychological, well, it's definitely psychiatric literature.
Yeah, the psychiatric literature.
Psychiatric literature, they don't like upsides of anything.
It's funny. I wrote this book also to be really sensitive to what I think are the wonderful contributions of CBT and ERP and ACT and all that stuff. And my point is not to say we get rid of that. I say is to blend it all together. But the other thing is that I want to say to clinicians out there and researchers out there, let's keep on looking at all these different angles of it. Because I was looking while I was researching the book. I was like, what do they say out there in the book about the origins of OCD? And I thought they were going to say it's biological or it's environmental. And they're like, we really don't know how much is. I'm like, you really don't know, but you're saying there's only a gold standard? We don't have a gold standard yet if we don't really know all the ins and outs.
It's a great point. I like in your book, you talk about how OCD presents sleights of hand that are possible to uncover if you know how to spot them. You call this performing upside magic. Tell me a little bit upside magic.
I mean, exactly what I did with that Law and Order episode of me, right? So OCD, I once had this client who came into me. This was like when I was a grad student. I was like 25. And she was extremely altruistic, kind, sweet as pie woman. And she said, Mike, I have this relentless obsession that I'm going to get brain damage. And at first I was trying to do the ERP with her and thinking, well, it's okay. We can tolerate the uncertainty that, if something is wrong, it's going to be okay. But then I was like, tell me a little bit more about the context. And as she was telling me, she told me that at work, someone playfully hit her on her arm and she wanted to say she didn't like it, but she didn't. And all of a sudden, her OCD came in. Now, the distraction, the sleight of hand, is that it's making her think that she has brain damage. When the real thing that it's really getting at is that she wants to say, no, stop it. Having a voice, right? And so being able to decode that and to look at the nuance of what's happening is super important. And that's what I think. OCD is very magical in that way. It performs the sleight of hand to say, oh no, you think I did the trick, but you don't see where the sleight. So I think our job as therapists is to help people see the sleight of hand.
Wow.
Which is actually really fun, isn't it?
It's fun in that context.
Yeah.
It's also fun, and I'm going to do some magic for you later.
Oh, perfect. I love it. Yeah.
It's fun in a real magic context as well. Both of us are fans of Irving Yalom, who has been a guest on this podcast.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've hung out with him at his home, and
I once saw him at the Networker conference, and I thanked him for showing all of us therapists how to be artists. And he said, "I'm not an artist."
Oh yes,
I said,
Come on.
Luckily, Sue
Bro.
Johnson said, "I think the guy has a point." Yeah. And I sent him the book that I wrote about it, which is about how we're artists as therapists, and he's like, I hear you now.
Good.
And I was like, okay, good.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. As he suggests, existentialism is what allows us to be more alive and creative as human beings.
Yeah.
You say having such a keen imagination and open heart makes those with OCD very susceptible to these existential concerns at nearly every turn. So would you argue that in his book, Existential Psychotherapy, which is a Bible for people like us?
Yeah, for people like that big,
he has a section, The Givens of Human Existence.
Yeah.
Do you think people with OCD are more sensitive to each of those givens?
Yeah, I think they know about those givens. I think they're aware of them precociously, very early. And also adults don't expect them to understand them and don't necessarily talk both in a way that's age appropriate and also that's a way that takes the sophistication. So, I think so. I have a story in the book about my son. Once we were downstairs during the pandemic, and my eyes flashed upon my old piano bench, and I started to think about my mom, who passed away many years back, and didn't get to meet my son. And I was feeling both the wistfulness of my mom. My mom prized my playing as a pianist; she encouraged it, and then I was thinking how I missed my mom being able to meet my child, my son. And my son, without missing a beat, he was about 3, said, "Dada, why are you sad?" Now he could pick up with that emotional sensitivity. He could tune into it.
Do you think he has OCD tendencies?
I think he has the sensitivity part of it.
Wow.
Because he misses nothing. I mean, his preschool teacher said, Aiden is lovely. He's smart. He's cute, but he misses nothing.
He misses nothing.
And I wanted to say, and he misses nothing. Right?
Good.
And exactly what you're saying is that I do think that people with OCD are keenly aware of the existential givens. Yes. And that's what I think is the beauty is that, so I joke in the book that OCD is like playing 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
And Kevin Bacon is the death.
Yeah.
But if you can focus, if you can actually face death, as Yalom talks about, then you're really living and making meaning out of life.
Yes. Well, how do you think Kevin Bacon would feel that you likened him to death at the core?
Yeah. I think he's been successful and still looks young enough to not really get too bothered by it. I consider it an homage, Kevin. Okay. I mean, really. Okay. Because if you think about it, I get it. I'm going to rationalize this one because if you think about it, when I'm talking about the Kevin Bacon, actually, when you're talking about death, you're actually really talking about life, right? So
the fear of death is really the fear of not being fully alive.
It's completely. That's it. And that's so poetry, like I was once taught, is both about love and loss.
Yeah.
It's about the line ending, but what we do with the breaks.
Yeah.
And it's about kind of being in that contradiction. So I really see Kevin Bacon, it's about life by facing death. Exactly what Yalom would say. Like Yalom doesn't write about existentialism being like, oh my gosh, like I'm a morbid goth.
He wrote a whole book on the importance of facing death.
Yeah. Like staring at the sun, right? Yeah.
Yeah, really beautiful
So
book.
Kevin Bacon is the sun.
Yeah. I get it. I think that's a good rationalization for making Kevin Bacon feel good about himself.
Yeah.
Because he's going to listen to this.
He's also a great musician too, by the way,
Let's not flatter Kevin Bacon too much.
Yeah, that's true.
He don't want his ego to get too out of control. Let's end this interview today with a point you made in your book. At its essence, what you did in your book is you drilled down to the core of OCD.
Yeah.
Which you conceptualize as a profound and precocious existential awareness that sensitizes you not only to loss, but also to the fragile beauty of life itself. You also explored how being in touch with these questions in a creative way with proper support could could make it possible to make this experience of OCD creative and awe-inspiring rather than terrifying. So I just want to thank you so much for stripping some of that terrifying nature of it and expanding our views of OCD. You've helped me personally in reading this book. I want to send a copy of this book to my mom and to anyone I know who has OCD and really humanize this in a really important way. And this was also my first time ever coming out as having OCD. So I thought this would be a good place to do that.
Welcome to the club. It's a good club to be a part of.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Michael. I am really so deeply appreciative of you being here. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Scott. This has just been a pleasure.